Time after time, with diseases like scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, sman, and even the failed virus cancer program, all ignored Koch's postulates and all proved to be non-infectious. All efforts to find infectious causes ended in a dismal failure. And now, HIV and AIDS?
It's obvious that HIV fails to cause AIDS beneath the microscopic lens and on the drawing board. But it doesn't fly in the population studies either. When we use the telescopic lens to observe the population at large, HIV's failure becomes linked to real names and faces. The population studies prove beyond a doubt that HIV does not cause AIDS. Number 8. AIDS has remained in its original risk groups for over 12 years.
When an infectious epidemic strikes, it begins in small clusters, then quickly spreads throughout the entire population. If a disease does not spread, it is not contagious and must be caused by something non-infectious. Figures compiled by Centers for Disease Control confirm that AIDS is not spreading into the population at large and is locked in its original risk groups. Homosexual males, IV drug users, hemophiliacs, and blood transfusion patients make up 97% of all AIDS patients and have continued at that rate for over 10 years. The remaining 3% of AIDS patients outside these risk groups are made up of persons who suffer from immunodeficiency at random and just happen to be infected with HIV. If AIDS is truly being caused by a virus, the patients who do not fit into these risk groups would be growing above the 3% as the disease spread. But AIDS has failed to spread into the female population also. When the U.S. Army began testing new recruits for HIV in 1984, they discovered an amazing fact. HIV infection was evenly spread between males and females, 50-50, and it's remained that way since then. It should follow that AIDS would be 50% male and 50% female. Yet 9 out of every 10 people who develop AIDS continue to be male. A germ-related disease should be spread evenly between the sexes, and though HIV is evenly spread, 90% of all U.S. AIDS cases develop only in males. This could explain why drug use is more related to AIDS than HIV infection. In the U.S., males use over 80% of all hard psychoactive drugs. And among the women with AIDS, over half use IV drugs also. In times past, every infectious disease has taken its toll on doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers who work with the infected. Yet AIDS has failed to spread here as well. With over 500,000 cases of AIDS, hardly one physician has developed AIDS as a result of an occupational HIV infection. In healthcare workers and laboratory technicians who cultivate high amounts of active HIV, there have been hundreds of confirmed accidental exposures and infections. Yet within the field of 5 million healthcare workers, only a handful of cases of AIDS have been reported, and even these are highly diluted. From the statistics generated by this vast population study, it becomes evident AIDS is more related to behavior and specific medical risks than it is to HIV infection. Even supporters of HIV concede AIDS is not becoming the world pandemic that was predicted. Reason number 9. International comparison of AIDS differ greatly. A germ-related disease would affect a population in the same way around the world. For example, an outbreak of cholera in India would be similar to an outbreak in Honduras. But AIDS statistics are totally different in the U.S. and Western industrialized nations compared to Africa. In the U.S., AIDS patients are 90% male, but in Africa, AIDS is evenly spread between the sexes. In the U.S., AIDS resides among risk groups at the rate of 97%. Yet in Africa, AIDS has no risk groups and is found at random in the general population. Only 62% of the AIDS diseases in the U.S. are microbial, but in Africa that number is approximately 90%. Likewise, the AIDS diseases in the U.S. that are not germ-related make up 38% of the total, a number that does not correlate with Africa at only 10%. HIV is believed to have originated in Africa, where an estimated 14 million have the virus. Because of malnutrition and other health conditions conducive to AIDS, statistics from Africa should be at least 14 times higher than in the U.S. Yet surprisingly, it's quite the opposite. People infected with HIV in the U.S. develop AIDS at a rate 10 to 20 times faster than Africans. Figures from the CDC and the World Health Organization have confirmed this since 1987 through 1995. So the question is, why would the AIDS epidemic behave so differently in the industrialized world?
One good explanation is that HIV does not cause AIDS, and the real causes are hard psychoactive drugs used primarily in the U.S. and Europe. Duisberg questions if what is being called AIDS in Africa is really the same epidemic.
But the African epidemic, I think, is a completely different epidemic. It affects men and women alike. In America, AIDS is 90% men, and in Europe, 90% men. That's epidemiologically as different as day and night. 50% compared to 90% is completely different. That's a totally different epidemic, the African one. And the diseases, likewise, are very different in the two continents. So clinically and epidemiologically, the two epidemics are very different. And in Africa, it's possibly malnutrition, parasitic infection, and poor sanitation. It affects, there are no risk groups. There's not homosexuals or intravenous drug users. It's just poor people without running water, without supermarkets, without doctors.
The London Sunday Times questions whether AIDS in Africa is a myth. Quoting Dr. Kohutni Ohulu, if tens of thousands are dying of AIDS in Africa, where are their graves?
Well, one of the members of our group is a fellow called Philippe Kreinen, who is up there in Tanzania, which is thought to be the epicenter of the AIDS outbreak. And there he and his wife, Evelyn, went to deal with orphans with AIDS. They're kind of well-to-do French do-gooders who, by the way, got quite a lot of money from France, I'm told, and who popularized the idea of AIDS in Africa. Well, after being on the ground there in Tanzania for a couple of years, he reported that after all this time we have to conclude that there is no AIDS and there are no orphans. The people that were thought to be orphans were actually being taken care of by their grandparents, while their own parents were off in Dar es Salaam making money. They came back at the end of the dry season or something like that. It's an amazing story. The AIDS diseases that these people were suffering from were just the same old diseases that everybody was suffering from in Africa from time immemorial. The only difference now is that if it was called an AIDS disease, then WHO and the United Nations send money. If it's called a diarrhea, what's new about a diarrhea in Africa? But if it's an AIDS diarrhea, well, then the United States sends money.
Finally, reason number 10. AIDS occurs without HIV infection, and most people with HIV never develop AIDS. The evidence in support of the HIV hypothesis based solely on correlation. Because the virus is often found in most AIDS patients, we have assumed HIV is causing AIDS. But the logic of that assumption is flawed because correlation does not prove causation. For example, the presence of HIV in AIDS patients is no more proof of the cause than the presence of birds on power lines prove that the birds cause power failures. They only correlate. So if HIV is a harmless passenger virus that only correlates with other real causes of AIDS, we should expect to see two things: people who are not infected with HIV, and HIV-infected people who are healthy and do not get AIDS. And that is exactly what is happening. What's also important is that different risk groups develop different diseases. Why would HIV supposedly cause one set of diseases in IV drug users and another set in homosexual males? Unless HIV is not the cause and other causes are at work. Do we find these specific AIDS diseases in the risk groups among persons who do not have the virus? The answer is definitely yes. Diseases like Kaposi sarcoma and advanced cytomegalovirus, which strike primarily gay males, have been found in numerous homosexual men who do not have HIV. But these men have one common denominator: the use of nitrite inhalants as aphrodisiacs that are known to be immunosuppressive. Thousands of American drug addicts who are not infected with HIV get the same tuberculosis, wasting syndrome, and pneumonias, and even lose the same CD4 T cells as those who are HIV positive. The slow death that resembles AIDS in heroin addicts has been observed and documented in the medical literature since 1898. So in these two risk groups that comprise over 90% of U.S. AIDS cases, there are other factors at work that could cause AIDS and have for years.
Peter Duesberg says there are 4,621 documented AIDS cases without HIV, and this number is much lower than it may actually be.